Good evening. My name is Malvina Talik, and I'm a research associate at the IDM here in Vienna. Thank you for joining us tonight for the IDMonSite on Poland. Poland has attracted a lot of international attention recently, but not necessarily for the reasons that the Polish government and the Polish society might have wished for. So protests against a nearly total ban of abortion have continued for since the late October, and meanwhile gone beyond the pro-choice cause. Today we'll take a look at how they have changed over this past 2 months. Moreover, for many weeks, Polish and Hungarian governments threatened to veto the EU budget over the rule of law clause. The compromise have been reached just last week. In today's IDMonSite, we'll discuss the underlying reasons for those developments and the implications that they may have for Poland and its relations with the EU. I am very happy to welcome our expert, Professor Renata Mieńkowska-Norkiene. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much for accepting it. Professor Renata Mieńkowska-Norkiene is a political scientist, sociologist, mediator, and associate professor at the University of Warsaw, and also a commenting expert for many TV programs in Poland. She specializes in the European integration and conflict management, and has also worked at the European Commission in the past. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let us start by taking a closer look at the demonstrations in Poland. So they are the largest protests since the fall of communism in Poland 30 years ago, and they have continued for nearly 2 months now. Could you explain to our audience what the status quo is, how they have changed over the past 2 months, and what keeps them alive?
Yes, so the protests have lasted for about 2 months, since 22nd of October, when the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland put almost a total ban on abortion. And the ruling has been considered politically initiated, actually, by Jarosław Kaczyński, who's in close relations with Julia Przyłębska. Constitutional Tribunal itself in Poland is also considered not to be fully legal, to be frank, which basically means that it does not have not only a, let's say, a social mandate, which would mean that the society believes and trusts the Constitutional Tribunal, but it also is considered as illegal by the scientists, by the experts. But this is one, let's say, aspect of the situation, just to explain why the whole protest thing, let's say, is so intense in Poland. But another thing is that basically this date of 22nd of October was the date when I think a sort of a critical mass gathered in the Polish society. And when women went to the streets to protest, they actually attracted also other groups of people who are disappointed, frustrated, and basically already fed up with what the government in Poland does, together with the whole pandemic, let's say, situation. And at the same time, this potential of a public protest, of a social protest, was also immediately a sort of channeled by the National Women's Strike, led by Marta Lempart and Klementyna Suchanow. And to be frank, you asked about the status quo. Marta Lempart suffers from COVID recently, COVID-19. And there is also a type of a scandal around it, because she was on the public TV in Poland today or yesterday. It was reported that she suffered from COVID-19, and there was a date of her test actually also revealed, which should be confidential as a, let's say, information about medical situation of a citizen. So the question why it's well known, well, that's another story, however. Yes, so those protests were extremely intensive at the very beginning, namely right after the ruling. So in the first 2-3 weeks, they were extremely intense and they were widespread. You properly mentioned, they were the biggest protests since, I would say, really, actually, I'm not sure if in the communist times there were such big protests. But in any case, according to the opinion polls, around 13% of the society took part in those protests, which means really a lot. Definitely, we can say these were millions. What is also important is that hundreds of cities, towns, and even villages were a sort of witnesses of those protests, which means that even people in the province protested. This is not so typical for those protests, particularly since in 2016, right when the Constitutional Tribunal was appointed illegally then, and with breaking the constitution, there were protests as well, but they were mainly in bigger cities, and a totally different, let's say, part of the society participated in them. So who participated in these protests now? These were, of course, mainly women. And why? Because they felt threatened. Mm-hmm. Of course, we understand that it's not only about the abortion, not even about the government and the poor management of COVID-19 situation, but also it was, let's say, a general frustration related to the fact that there is hardly any representation for modern, liberal part of the society. The young, the liberal, also the middle class that is not totally conservative. And even if they are still not conservative enough to, let's say, just accept a almost total ban on abortion. Plus, there was a frustration with what Catholic Church did in Poland. And this aspect is extremely important because some people protested, particularly at the very beginning of the protests, also in churches. And this caused, I would say, a kind of an answer from people called now in the public space Dziadersi. And I'm really pointing out this name. Dziadersi is a person who is a little bit old-fashioned, conservative, and doesn't understand the real core of the protest. So it's usually a person who really doesn't understand that people just simply want to have certain freedom. It's usually a Catholic, usually, let's say, a little bit misogynic or a sort of discriminative. Well, in any case, these people immediately accused women and basically the protesters of, let's say, invading the churches, attacking Catholics as such, and Catholic beliefs. And this was also an important aspect because Catholic Church has an extremely important role in, let's say, making more and more strict this law on abortion. So basically, to put it all together, this very beginning was really intense in the sense that women and many other groups like young people, like LGBT+, because it has become a social movement, according to the scientific definition, which means frustrated people who see no possibility to represent their interests with the use of regular, let's say, instruments like political parties, opposition parties, for example. This is also quite important, this aspect, because opposition parties, they supported basically, apart from, of course, Confederation, but that's a different story. This is the ultra, so extreme right political party. And most probably, Jarosław Kaczyński, so now the person who is the most important in Poland, wanted to steal some voters from Confederation, and probably also due to that, he initiated this ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal. But just coming back to the opposition, so the liberal, let's say, and pro-democratic opposition parties in Poland, they sort of supported this, the strikes and protests and this social movement. But basically the reactions were diversified. So the links, they definitely supported the protests. They didn't immediately signed under them. They just, let's say, watched and really supported also in the streets the protesting women and supporting them, let's say, men and young people and LGBT plus representatives. While speaking about Civic Coalition, which is now the biggest opposition party, this was a bit divided. So there are many conservative people in this party, also called the Jaders, and their reaction at first was really not univocal, I would say. It was, I would say, rather from total criticism because of this attacking of Catholicism and using, let's say, curses and really not elegant words, to those who really supported Protestants also in the streets. For example, Barbara Nowacka, who, by the way, was sprayed with gas by one of the policemen, although she showed her ID as an MP. So yeah, this also caused a really tough reaction of the police. And this is also a very important aspect of the protests. Recently, well, so the protests, they are, let's say, intense in waves, I would say. They were extremely intense at the very beginning. Then, of course, they sort of got calmed a little bit, but this does not mean they were totally forgotten. So women, they started, let's say, preparing a certain agenda also with meaningful postulates. And then there were protests over 11th of November, when also there were protests and incidents, not nice incidents of extreme rights and nationalists. They burned, for example, one of the apartments where they saw the sign of the women's strikes. So after that, women again went to the streets. And recently, I think that the biggest, I'm finishing, the biggest wave was on the day, which was 102nd anniversary of voting rights for women in Poland. And this was also the day when women women and many other groups also, let's be honest, because there is also this word, postulate, you will never go alone. So there are many supporters really of women. And this was, I think, the last really intense day of protests and marching. But let's be honest, since the police started really quite tough, I would say, reactions towards the protesters. For example, giving fines to participating youngsters, for example. They are illegal. But, you know, the reaction might be, okay, so a youngster of, I don't know, 15, 16 goes home with a fine of 100 zlotys. So what can the parents do? They put a ban on that, okay? You will not go to the streets again because it's dangerous and because you get fines. So the police definitely tries to freeze many people and milder a little bit the motivation to go to the streets. And this reaction is definitely initiated by the government, by Jarosław Kaczyński for sure, by Minister of Interior. And this definitely is not democratic. This definitely doesn't show that there is a basic understanding for civic rights, for fundamental rights, because this is what protests are about. They are sort of using fundamental rights to show the, let's say, discontent, disagreement regarding what the government simply does, while opposition parties have hardly any instruments or don't even fully want to represent those protesters. But it's also, maybe one final sentence, it's also worth mentioning that there is a council, special advisory council established by the National Women's Strike that is dealing with postulates and has already revealed the main postulates which they require the government to fulfill and to answer to, whereas not only the question of abortion in them, but also the question of public health and education and civic rights, strengthening civic fundamental rights. So there are certain political also movements on the side of the women's strike and those protesters, which hopefully will be put, I don't know which way, probably by the opposition, because I don't believe that the government will put them on the political agenda soon.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick question, since you mentioned youngsters, why do you think they got so politically involved? Because, or why do they participate in the protests in such large numbers? Do you think that other protests around the world, like Black Lives Matter demonstrations or protests in Belarus, might have an impact?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that indeed there might have been some impact of those protests. By the way, the Polish youngsters, they also participated in this general movement of youngsters against, let's say, a lack of reaction towards climate change. Mm-hmm. However, I wouldn't say it was the main reason. Definitely the main reason was simply this ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal, plus, as I said, this critical mass. And also a lot of hope from the National Women's Strike, who simply proved or have given evidences that they are able to organize strikes. You are right that there is a certain sense of, let's say, deprivation from instruments of influencing politics by youngsters. We call it in political science post-representation, which means young people, but also many other groups, feel that they do not have a proper political representation because none of the really serious, meaningful parties has postulates which youngsters simply want to be put on the agenda. And in Poland, we have a very specific situation because both on the government side and on the opposition, the biggest parties are conservative, are Catholic. So those youngsters who are not that Catholic, who do not want to follow orders of the Catholic Church hierarchs, they have hardly any representation. There are only the links, but in Poland, the left party is, I would say, a bit specific because they are too closely connected to the communist times. Mm-hmm. And, they are too far, let's say, identified with the communist times, and therefore they are not really modern left in the understanding which we know from other countries in the world. There are extreme left parties, but they haven't gained, let's say, proper support to really attract attention, a broader attention. We have also a new movement of Szymon Hołownia. Szymon Hołownia is a former celebrity who participated in the presidential elections in May and then in July, and he attracted actually more than 13% of the support, which has made him a kind of an important player on the political scene in Poland. He's not the first one. Before him, there was Paweł Kukiz, also a former singer, pop singer, and there was also Ryszard Petrus, a former famous economist in Poland. So there were ephemerical parties which appeared and then disappeared that attracted people's attention and some voters. But Szymon Hołownia might be something different in the sense that he's central right oriented. Again, look, that's the single alternative for central right oriented or right wing parties is again central right or a right wing party, just new. That's very specific, I would say, about Poland. So Szymon Hołownia, he hopes to attract those people who are disappointed with law and justice and will not vote for it anymore, who are disappointed with Civic Coalition, also will not vote for them, or Civic Coalition also seems to be quite old-fashioned, but they are quite conservative and still grew up, in this Catholic, let's say, atmosphere and in this quite conservative atmosphere. Because let's be honest, the Polish society is to a large extent conservative. We grew up with Catholic Church everywhere. people go to religion classes in primary and secondary schools, and they used to be widespread. Now it's a little bit limited, but still we've got more classes of religion at school, although they are not obligatory, but usually they are in the middle, let's say, of the day, so that people do not skip them. More than of geography or biology. So you can imagine, I mean, people are indoctrinated. Not all of them give up, of course, mentally, but still there is an effort. So Catholic Church has an extreme influence in Poland, plus it influences politics. And this is also very important, and political agenda. And probably this was also the reason why Law and Justice decided to order this ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal. Plus, as far as I suppose, Jarosław Kaczyński simply thought that if no one goes to the streets, fantastic, we have an almost total ban on abortion. If people don't stay at home, just go outside, they might be accused of spreading the, COVID-19 and coronavirus. So Kaczyński thought it would be a win-win situation, but it hasn't been the case, as we know from the protests. And maybe the very final thing that Jarosław Kaczyński, he made his own citizens, so citizens of Poland, youngsters, also foreign policy, European policy, whatever else, hostages actually of his own ambitions and his own, let's say, political party and political and governing coalition, let's say, tensions. And this is also something that young people are already, but basically those who protest, are fed up with, really, because they do not feel that the governing party simply really cares for the people. It rather cares, and this is how it's perceived, for, let's say, maintaining the unity within the coalition and somehow defeating internal tensions in the coalition. So this is also not the politics that the Polish society expects in the COVID time, in the crisis time.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Polish society is predominantly conservative, but at the same time, Poles are among the most pro-European nations in the EU. So let's talk about Poland and the EU. On November 26th, the European Parliament adopted a resolution that strongly condemns Poland's recent tightening of abortion rights. In your opinion, how may this resolution affect the relations between Poland and the EU and other member states, especially when we take into consideration also the recent threat by the Polish government to veto the EU's budget, a threat that luckily was not delivered on?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. Again, very complex. You speak to me from Vienna, and Austria was one of those so-called Frugal Four members. So those who wanted not only, let's say, a kind of a strict budget, but also really linking expenses related to the EU budget with the rule of law. And this is fully understandable because indeed, both Poland and Hungary that tried to veto the multi-annual financial framework and Next Generation EU and the regulation that links spending of the EU money with sticking to the rule of law. And of course, we had different reasons. So Hungary simply wanted to spend a lot of money illegally, and this has already been proven that Hungary has, as a country, problem with it, and in particular, of course, Viktor Orban. So in OLAF, anti-fraud office of the European Union, there are numerous cases of Hungary and many sentences already. But with Poland, it's a little bit different because Poland, first of all, wanted to probably somehow support Hungary. And the second reason is that we have real problem with the rule of law in Poland, and there are evidences of that, and there is a procedure under Article 7 of the Treaty of Lisbon, so Treaty of the European Union. So Poland, the Polish government simply wanted to be protected from responsibility if it breaks the rule of law and the Polish constitution and the EU law in spending the EU money. So basically, our government vetoed something that protects Polish citizens from misuse of the power. This is incredible, and Polish government tried to sell it to the people as doing good. Let's say this is incredible, but you see, communication, propaganda, the fact that the Polish government actually owns the public TV and can spend enormous money on the public TV. In France, on all media, the budget, let's say, spent national budget, it's not more than 200 million euros. In Poland, it's more than 500 million euros, if you could imagine, yearly, only on the public TV. So you can imagine that's hard to believe, but that's the case. So the public TV is, and hence it's just one of the instruments of simply governing, in this case, the Polish minds. So if you have that, you also have influence on people's, let's say, attitude towards the European Union. And indeed, the Polish, they are extremely pro-European. But when you hear all the time that your government simply tries to protect us from, let's say, Germany that misuses its incredible power in the European Union, from frugal four that don't want to share with the others, and you know, the whole, and that Poland, for example, with Hungary, tried to protect Portugal, Spain, and so on from potential misuse of the regulation against them. This is already really a kind of a strange explanation, but still. So it was the case. And therefore, many Poles, let's say, somehow started thinking about whether maybe something is there. But basically, it hasn't changed the Polish attitude, the attitude of the Polish society too much. And probably also, therefore, our government hasn't finally risked the veto. And there is a compromise, as we know. But together with all that, there comes also a conclusion. I'm a political scientist, so I can see it quite clearly, that again, the whole question of the European integration, of well-being of the Europeans, and also the fundamental values which the EU protects. Because in Article 2 of the Treaty of Lisbon, we have those values enlisted. There is also equality, dignity, and equal treatment, solidarity, and so on. And there is Article 3 that we sometimes omit, where it's put as one of the groundings also for the basic goals of the European integration. Integration is also about strengthening, maintaining the European values. So if I hear from the Polish government that we have our own values and we have to protect our values from the European Union, I don't get the point, because you see, the core of the European integration is not, and this is how our government tried to sell it to the people, it's not about, let's say, a homosexual person who has this unluck to be born in Poland, that this person has to go to the Netherlands to feel comfortable, to feel simply equal to the others. It's not what the European integration is about and free movement of persons is about. It's about creating similar conditions for all European citizens in all member states, so that the person who is homosexual in Poland feels good in Poland and feels at home in Poland. Same story with the homosexual person who comes from the Netherlands to Poland, for example. This person also should feel comfortable and equal to the others. If this is what we consider something wrong and not fitting our values, and what are our values then? Inequality? Is this our value? Or I don't know, depriving women? That's also another story, because of course the EU doesn't regulate abortion. No, it's not the competence of the European Union, European institutions. But if abortion is forbidden in a case in which there is really irreversible and really heavy disability of fetus, and woman is prone to, let's say, give birth to such kind of a fetus which is fully disabled, and this costs her health and, let's say, her well-being, then she's not treated with dignity, she's not treated in a human way. And this is already a fundamental right which is protected not only by the European Union, but also by the Council of Europe and basically by international standards. So this is something that has been forgotten in all this discussion. So I think that from this point of view, this resolution of the European Parliament is understandable. And this is not the single resolution against the Polish government. Of course, there are numerous regarding LGBT plus free zones and so on and so forth. So this is also worth mentioning that I think that the Polish government really puts this question or this problem in a way which is disinforming simply and misinforming people in Poland. This is simply a part of the propaganda, but it has its reason, because Jarosław Kaczyński has a kind of a person who is not always obedient, namely Zbigniew Ziobro, a Minister of Justice, and who sometimes really puts the things quite sharp and tough. And he's extremely conservative, and he tries also to promote Ordo Iuris, which is an organization that is actually quite fundamental regarding Catholic values and so on. This organization wants Poland to become a kind of a country based upon Catholic values, with total ban on abortion and so on. And we also have to understand that the question of abortion is also a problem, and probably it also took so many people to the streets to protest, that we have a very weak sexual education in Poland, while we have 2 hours per week of religion. And we also have a real problem with the availability of contraception in Poland. So young women, they really have a problem with proper contraception. So you see, taking all that into consideration, this right to abortion, at least in those cases where we can, let's say, diagnose, and this is stated also medically, that there is a heavy and irreversible disability of the fetus, then this obviously causes a threat to women, to the whole families, and to well-being of the citizens. But Jarosław Kaczyński, simply to satisfy Ziobro, who sometimes simply risks or puts the whole coalition at risk, he just sometimes satisfies his requirements. Plus, I suppose that Kaczyński also wants to gain votes on the extreme right side of the Polish political scene, because he loses votes in the center. So the middle class and people who are not that conservative and who are already fed up with, let's say, breaking the rule of law and so on, they resign of supporting law and justice, and they go usually towards Szymon Hołownia. And therefore, for example, yesterday, the day before yesterday, sorry, I want to mention it in the last sentence here, there was an opinion poll, a survey of Kantar, which showed that Law and Justice has a support of around 25%, and exactly the same support has the Civic Coalition, which basically, and Szymon Hołownia has also around 13 plus something percent of a support, which basically means that Law and Justice has a serious reason to think about its future. And it also, this opinion poll shows that the society wants a unity of the coalition government in the government. So Kaczyński will now satisfy probably even more Ziobro's requirements and expectations, because Kaczyński knows that if he puts this coalition and its unity at risk, there will be either minority government, which is possible and doable, but not really comfortable for Kaczyński, or there is simply a risk for the whole governing option, and then probably also elections sooner than in 3 years' time, basically in spring, maybe.
But is this a new development, that the Law and Justice is losing support? Because until now, despite their views, despite their values and plans, which were no secret to the public, Law and Justice kept winning. It won elections,
and around 40%
twice in a row. Its candidates won presidential elections twice. So actually, despite all of this, Law and Justice seemed very popular. Do you think that the protests could have affected that, or social content?
What I can see as a political scientist and analyst is that Law and Justice is losing in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. Maybe it cannot immediately be seen in the opinion polls, because at the same time, it's gaining on the extreme right side of the political scene. However, it has a competitor on the right, extreme right, which is Confederation, plus Zbigniew Ziobro, of course, but Ziobro doesn't count because his party can count on maybe 1.5% of support, maybe 2%. But still, Confederation means and matters, while Kaczyński indeed loses in the middle. Particularly those people who are fed up with Catholic Church and used to support Kaczyński because of Catholicism, traditionalism, and so on, they might reconsider their perception of the whole situation. Plus, let's be honest, there is really a growing economic problem in Poland, because people lose their jobs. So they are losing their jobs due to COVID-19. They go bankrupt. And this is really a tendency, and it will deepen now, so in the nearest future. And so yes, there is indeed a kind of a process now of losing support, particularly in the middle of the political scene, by the law and justice. But since the compromise has been achieved on European level, there will be soon the new money from the EU activated from Next Generation EU. And Law and Justice will really get a lot of financial support from the EU. I really mention Law and Justice because only a tiny part of this money will go directly to self-governments or directly to NGOs. It will go through the government. And this is actually what Law and Justice was afraid of, that they would have to really stick to the rule of law while dividing this money among, let's say, citizens and simply spending it. So this money will come to Poland, and definitely Law and Justice will do everything possible. Public TV, and it's not only public TV. Law and Justice has just, Orlen, which is supported, which is a budget, let's say, budgetary company, one of the biggest company, actually national company. It took over Polska Press, which is a publisher. It was owner of 20 out of the 22 titles of the Polish journals, so press on local level. So we may actually say that the local press in Poland has just been overtaken by Law and Justice, because Orlen is fully dependent on the governing party, which basically means there is another channel now of spreading information by the governing party, and again, well, actually spreading propaganda. So taking this into consideration, one has to be aware of the fact that spending the EU money will be always accompanied in Poland by this message that this is the government that is really giving the money to the people and so on. And probably the EU will not even be mentioned. Or it will be even accused of any lax related to the process. So this may strengthen actually support for Law and Justice, although there is another tendency, namely, let's say, the Catholic Church, which is, there are more and more scandals related to the Catholic Church, so more and more people probably will leave the Church, whether officially by apostasia or unofficially. But this will also put a shadow on Law and Justice, probably. But if the European Union doesn't really send the proper signal together with the funding to Poland, that this is the money from the EU, this is the money that should be spent according to the rule of law and so on, it might be also a kind of an injection for Law and Justice, of a support for Law and Justice, because Law and Justice will definitely spread information that this is all the government support, and that this money comes from the government. So yeah, this will most probably change the tendency, and Law and Justice will definitely regain a part of the support. To what extent it will maintain the governing party by the power for the forthcoming 3 years, difficult to say. If Zbigniew Ziobro really is disobedient, it might be the case that Jarosław Kaczyński will try to get rid of him by organizing elections in spring. But honestly, next year's spring, but honestly, he might not want to risk, because he did it once in 2007, he lost.
So we established that the Constitutional Tribunal is politically dependent, or many see it as illegal. Now, you mentioned the case of Polska Press, where actually media seems to be threatened and be also politically dependent, at least at the local level. What does it mean for Poland, for Polish democracy, for the freedom of press, for the rule of law? Should we worry?
Yes, we should be worried. I mean, those who are Democrats and support democracy, liberal democracy, as a system which provides us all with the kind of, in German, you have a wonderful word, Wohlfühlen. So maybe it's like a kind of a welfare and, you know, well-being, this kind of feeling. So yes, there is a problem with the rule of law and with democracy in Poland. As a political scientist, I can tell you that there are objective criteria of sliding back from democracy by the Polish government and Poland as the country. It's the ratings. Reporters Sans Frontières index puts Poland now on, I don't know, 60-some place. According to the freedom of the media. We used to be on 18th place. Now it's 64th, I think. Well, now it's really, really low. Another thing is democracy index, of course, different indexes where Poland has fallen down really meaningfully. There is this procedure under Article 7, which basically was launched because Poland was considered seriously breaking or seriously threatening the rule of law. There are also other criteria. I don't know, in the book, How Democracies Die, you also have different criteria of sliding back from democracy. And we are really far on this way towards authoritarianism. Plus, you know, if the opposition doesn't have any influence on governing, managing such a crisis as the COVID crisis. If there is one person actually governing this country, although we have democracy, if, let's say, the ombudsman in Poland hasn't been appointed yet, although we have a great candidate with support of numerous civic organizations and almost whole civic society, and she's not appointed because, although she's very well qualified for the post, she's not appointed, while there are other candidates really morally suspicious, to be euphemistic, provided, but of course they are members of Law and Justice, or they are active politicians of Law and Justice. This all doesn't show that that people can be really protected in this system, in particular those who belong to minorities, who are pro-democratic, or who publicly do not support Law and Justice. Plus, we have tinier but also meaningful signals which show that we are sliding back from democracy, like a Minister of Education and Higher Education is now really ideologically persuading some solutions which are totally not in line with the concept of science as such. Instead of dealing with meaningful problems like distant teaching and distant learning, like pupils fallen out of the system, he's talking about, I don't know, John Paul II's heritage, or about Catholicism that should be more meaningful, Catholic, let's say, doctrine more meaningful in higher education. This is also, I would say, unrelated to the real problems of the higher education that we have been facing as let's say the higher education. But also various groups of the society are deprived of different services, healthcare, let's say, education, other types of services. But the government doesn't deal with that. They deal rather with dismantling democracy in Poland. So yes, taking all that into consideration, I fully understand that both the European Parliament and other institutions, the European Commission, but also basically lots of other international organizations like Council of Europe and so on, really are concerned with what is going on in Poland, and that also the Polish citizens are. And that's why they go to the streets and they participate in the protests. And by the way, you know, these protests, they were really, because one has to understand that they were really interesting in a sense that those transparents and what was on them was really funny. It was with a lot of humor, a lot of distance, a lot of solidarity involved. And, you know, the reaction to that was Jarosław Kaczyński showing off on Facebook and looking like Jaruzelski, who basically really kind of talked about almost war in communist times, and who was threatening the people, you know, and calling to protect churches. And basically, as some nationalists, they listened to that, but they didn't really have opportunity to react. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and the police really treating in a terrible way those protesters, in particular those youngsters, you know, that really were punished, and there were fines put on them, and there are some cases of broken hands and so on by the police, and no one bears responsibility for that. You know, this also dismantles the public trust towards such institutions as the police. You know, I mean, I would understand, I'm trying to understand our government. I try to appreciate things that have been done well, like, I don't know, fighting with the VAT, let's say, frauds in Poland and so on. There were some examples of a really efforts to do something in a good way, in a proper way, even successful, the 500 plus. But you see, in the whole context of dismantling democracy in Poland, this is just, it's a pity that I cannot evaluate it in a different way, in particular in this difficult time of crisis. I mean, in Portugal, there was a huge coalition, let's say, built over the pandemic crisis, where both the governing parties and the opposition, they acted together and somehow solidarily to support the society. Here in Poland, we have been facing a really different approach, unfortunately. And the opposition is too weak, I would say. And as I told you, it's also conservative. So they really care for this, for Catholic Church, and for, let's say, a lack of elegance of some of the protesters, instead of supporting them and trying to somehow channel this big social, let's say, resistance capital towards political influence, because they still have some influence. I mean, they should at least try to build some structures over the strike and somehow support women in that, even if it wouldn't be publicly done.
I just have two quick questions. One is, what can the civil society, NGOs, think tanks, also like ours, do to support democracy in Poland? That would be one. And the other one, you say that most people are conservative. How many people really support the protests? I mean, is it maybe minority? Because this may be the image that some people get.
No, I'll begin with the last part of your question. Mm-hmm. There has been surveys, obviously, conducted regarding the strike, the women's strike and protests, and according to them, around 70% of the Polish society support the strikes, mm-hmm. and around 13% participate in the strike, which is 13% of the Polish society basically means really 1 million or even more. So you can imagine, no, it's more than 3 million people actually. Now, speaking about, even if it's exaggerated, let's take a half of it. It's 1.5 million people. That's really a lot. And support of 70%. So that's one thing. Another thing, what think tanks could do, like yours, support our opposition, please, and convince them that they shouldn't just take popcorn and wait until the governing party makes mistakes, and just collapses, because this may never happen. Law and Justice is determined to finish the reforms, deforms as we call them, they launched. They are determined to even change the electoral law, and they already have shown that they will not resist to break the constitution in order to maintain the power. So if our opposition only sits down and wait, this will not bring anything good. So what the opposition needs is definitely more motivation to act, more motivation to support women and the whole, let's say, national women's strike. Plus, they should do it in an elegant way and in a way which would not, let's say, politicize the protests too much. So this has to be done really, I would say, with a lot of sensitivity towards the situation. And what else? Communication strategy. I think that our opposition, in particular, those democratic, let's say, parties like Civic Coalition, the left, they don't have good ideas on how to deal with a proper communication, simply. They do not have communication strategy, and they also don't really have a program. They should build up a political program, which they do not seem to have at the moment. And we are trying to do our best to convince them they should act, and even to tell them, sometimes give them some pieces of advice, what to do and how to do that, but they do not seem to listen. They prefer rather to wait. In particular, taking into consideration the fact that I think their perception of the situation is that now we have been dealing with such an enormous crisis that it doesn't even make much sense to overtake the power, because then it would mean you have to really try hard to deal with the crisis, and it may end up in losing the power soon. So, but this is not a good strategy, because as I told you, we will get a lot of money from the European Union, from the next generation EU. So this is a good opportunity to overtake the power and then to simply manage those funds properly. So yeah, maybe this would be something, maybe also to support the women's strike, you know, because they also need structures. They need to know how to channel or how to transform this social capital into political capital. This is not so easy, because numerous social movements from the past, they show that without a proper, let's say, representation, sometimes the social movements, the revolutions may eat their own children. So this is a sort of also an important aspect, I would say.
Okay, our discussion is slowly coming to an end. This year is also coming into an end. So now another quick question. What do you think will happen in Poland next year? Can we be optimistic about it or not? Can we be optimistic about the young people who actually seem to be getting more and more politically involved?
Well, that's a good question. 2020 was a terrible year, honestly, in numerous aspects. So I would I would hope for a better year. Your question is probably also related with the question whether the elections will take place and whether Law and Justice will maintain its power or maybe even go further in dismantling democracy. It is all possible. I do hope that the EU funds will be spent in a way which will help the Polish economy, the Polish society really recover from the pandemic. And this is my main concern. Maybe the new, let's say, ideas around healthcare and public health will also bring the COVID vaccinations and resistance towards this virus. Hopefully it will be the case, and it will also help us start living normally after this definitely abnormal time of 2020. So these are my hopes and developments that I expect will indeed be the case. I think that Jarosław Kaczyński is really afraid of elections in spring, but since the situation might be really tough then, and Zbigniew Ziobro may put at risk the unanimity and unity of the governing coalition, it might be that Kaczyński will decide he would organize elections in spring. But how it will end, it's dependent mainly on our opposition, and whether the opposition will have enough motivation to really take care for the situation and really fight for the power. That's a different story. For the moment, it doesn't seem to. But hopefully, new year, new energy in the opposition as well.
Let's hope for the best and prepare for the worst, as the saying goes.
Yeah, that's a very good conclusion of our discussion, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much
for your precious insights in the current political situation in Poland. All the best to you. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much to all of us, I would say. Thank you for the invitation.